Welcome to the SEEP Network webinar, appropriately titled Mr. Biden Goes to Washington. I am truly grateful for this collaboration and for all the great webinar offerings that the SEEP Network has made available. As mentioned in the advance notices for this webinar, the church with its many ministries and far-reaching impact across society will undoubtedly be impacted by these changes in the federal government. During this webinar, we will consider what changes in Washington mean not only for our nation, but also for our church, our partners in mission, and for the worldwide Anglican Communion. And ultimately, I would add, what this all means for you in your congregations and dioceses. To help us in this task, we have 4 leaders on the church-wide staff who, together with their respective departments, who comprise the team, the Presiding Bishop's team for ministry beyond the Episcopal Church, or as we affectionately call it, Team Beyond. Demetrio Alvero is Director of Operations for Episcopal Migration Ministries, which for the past 40 years has been one of the 9 official refugee resettlement agencies for the United States. And for the past 80 years, the Church Engagement Unit of EMM has supported refugees, asylum seekers, and others who have left horrific situations in search of a new home and a new hope. Demetrio knows well what he talks about. As a child, he came to this land a refugee from Cuba during the days of the revolution. Welcome, Demetrio. Rebecca Blachly is Director of our Office of Government Relations, situated on Capitol Hill. OGR represents the policy priorities of the Episcopal Church to the US government and helps shape the discussion of political issues throughout the church, especially through the Episcopal Public Policy Network, or EPPN. Rebecca, before this, previously served in both the US Department of State and the US Department of Defense. Welcome, Rebecca. The Reverend David Copley is Director of Global Partnerships and Mission Personnel, nurturing relationships between the Episcopal Church and our partners throughout the Anglican Communion, as well as providing advocacy efforts at the United Nations and direct mission engagement through the Episcopal Volunteers in Mission, or EVIM, and the Young Adult Service Corps, or YASC. This office also assists congregations and dioceses to develop and foster their own global connections. Before coming to the church-wide offices, David previously spent years overseas in mission work, together with his spouse, who is currently a parish priest in the Diocese of New York. The Reverend Margaret Rose is Director of Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations, deepening our connections and collaborative work with full communion partners like the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Moravian Church, while promoting continued dialogue with other Christian churches and engagement with other religious faiths. She is active in leadership in the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches, Religions for Peace USA, and other organizations. Margaret also understands the importance of these partnerships on the local level, having spent nearly 20 years of her ordained life in parish ministry. Thanks to the 4 of you for helping us navigate through the possible ramifications of this upcoming political transition. Rebecca, let's start with you. As we all know, the past several weeks since the election have been fraught. Well, that's an understatement. But as we move towards the actual transition on the 20th, what challenges do you see the Biden-Harris administration facing? And what immediate impact, if any, might we expect for the people in our congregations and dioceses?
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks so much to SEEP for hosting us on this webinar. It's great to be with you and look forward to the discussion. Indeed, as you said, it is a really interesting and important time, and things have changed from when I was preparing for this just a week ago. So I'll first just give an update about where things are. I think that'll have a lot of bearing on what occurs in the coming weeks and really what the possibilities are and may be for the new administration. So first, just a kind of current update. We have heard that the House stopped the House from moving forward. Republicans in the House had stopped moving forward with an impeachment amendment that was put forward to use the 25th Amendment. And so it looks like there will be something that will pass on a vote tomorrow. And then will be an article of impeachment that it looks like will move forward. And there could be a vote as soon as Wednesday on the House side for impeachment. And that could either go forward immediately or it could wait. We've heard different things from Democratic leadership. So that is just a big piece that we'll have to wait and see and what kind of impact that has in the early days of the Biden administration. In Congress, we were obviously waiting for the Georgia election, and now there is a 50-50 split in the Senate. So that means that the vice president will be the tie-breaking vote. The Senate will need to do the majority of business through the budget reconciliation process, which only needs a bare majority in the Senate to get through rather than the 60 vote majority that's typically needed for legislative business. This may mean that some of the work that would be done normally is put into bills relating to revenue and taxes and spending. That's the kind of legislation that can pass through the budget reconciliation process. And a 50-50 split is slightly different than having a majority. The last time that this happened was in 2000, and it resulted in some different, a power sharing plan that had some different procedures and processes for how leadership ran the Senate. So a couple of things that will be coming up for Congress: the COVID stimulus provisions that were passed just at the very end of last year run out in March. Things like additional food assistance and housing assistance, unemployment benefits. So Congress will really need to be engaging on stimulus relief, even in the very early days of the administration. Looking ahead to later in the year, the debt ceiling will need to be renegotiated. It may be around the October, November, December timeframe. It really depends. But that could be a major fight that we'll see legislatively in the coming year. And then, of course, Congress has the usual business of confirmations of President Biden's team, appropriations bills, and other legislation as necessary. So the Biden-Harris administration has identified 4 priority areas: COVID-19 relief, economic recovery, racial equity, and climate change. And so these are very big areas, and they've got a very ambitious policy agenda that they've laid out. It's more likely that it will be able to move forward because of the Senate and what that looks like. So we are eager to work with the administration, work with Congress. We've been in touch with folks on the transition team to talk through priorities. What does this mean for you in parishes and around the church? I think that the economic recovery piece is really key and may impact what you're doing with food assistance, again, helping those who are facing homelessness, hunger, and food insecurity. The COVID stimulus bill is something to watch for. COVID response and vaccine rollout, again, we're seeing faith communities play a role in some of that. And so depending on the Biden administration's plan and what that looks like, there may be a place for the Episcopal churches around the country to assist in that and make that rollout a little bit more effective. And then we'll see some major policy changes, I expect, around immigration, whether that's the reinstatement of DACA or changing and updating some of the asylum policies. Demetrio will speak more about refugee resettlement. There will be lots of advocacy opportunities. I'll just note finally that there's also been a change to shareholder engagement rules for those of you who look and work in the corporate social responsibility, socially responsible investing space. The Trump administration had changed the rule around shareholder proposals. And so there is an effort by the incoming administration to roll that back by a new rule or by challenging the rule in that way. So happy to speak more about that. But Ken and Chuck, thank you for the chance to lay out some of the big picture items and where we are.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And you did mention as one of those issues around immigration and refugee resettlement. Demetrio, this is a significant change of administration as we see the nation's policy towards refugees change. Indeed, one of the first pronouncements that President-elect Biden made concerned a dramatic increase in the annual presidential determination and what that will look like. But what does it actually mean? Can you walk us through a brief primer on how the refugee resettlement system actually works and what it means for faith communities who historically have been involved with this work on the local level?
Thank you, Chuck. And I want to thank the SEEP Network for making time available to discuss these issues. It is a big change to lift the refugee admission ceilings from 15,000 to 125,000. But while we're pleased with the change in direction, in reality, it's more of an aspirational announcement. that will really take about 12 to 18 months to realize. The reason is that the refugee resettlement is a worldwide program which the United States plays its part. Individuals, when they flee their home country and seek asylum in another country due to persecution, are usually offered protection in those countries of asylum. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees ensures that those that are offered protection in these asylum countries fall under their mandate as refugees, whatever their status is in these countries. And I should point out that while the United Nations may recognize individuals as refugees, they may not be recognized as such in some of these countries. Of the 26 million refugees that are presently under the UNHCR mandate, less than 0.5% are in such precarious conditions that they are deemed by the High Commissioner for Refugees as eligible to be part of the refugee resettlement program. There are 28 countries in the program, and the US had been one of the world leaders in the resettlement program. But these past 4 years have seen its leadership virtually vanish. And this has had implications for the US program. In part, it has to do with infrastructure, both the infrastructure that processes refugees overseas and the infrastructure domestically that assists refugees once they arrive here. With fewer and fewer refugees arriving across the United States, we have seen a closure of resettlement sites here in this country. For EMM, that has meant from having 31 sites to just 12 to assist in the resettlement program. To build back that capacity, both overseas and domestically, will take time, effort, and funding. It has taken over 40 years to build this infrastructure, and now we will need to rebuild it again if we are to achieve the goals of the new administration. EMM, for its part, will in the coming months be reaching out to congregations that have supported our network of sites to try to build back the program. The program is a private-public partnership, and it relies heavily on volunteer support and donations, both in kind and in cash. It is the backbone of the program. And we will have to build relationships that diminished over the past 4 years. As fewer and fewer refugees arrived, attentions from congregations were diverted and placed elsewhere. And so we will need to work on that and to re-energize our congregations across the Episcopal Church as we slowly build back this program over time. And that's the task before us with this new administration.
So a challenge indeed, but at least a hopeful challenge as we take time to move forward, but not something that's happening overnight.
Not at all.
We'll come back and talk about some of the other things that we need to think about in this whole realm of immigrants, of immigration, migration patterns. But thank you for helping kind of spell out some of these things with refugee resettlement. David, turning to you, as Episcopalians, we're part of a global network we call the Anglican Communion. Before exploring what this political transition in the US means for our church partners throughout the world, can you first just tell us a little about your own team, the Global Partnership Submission Personnel Team, and what resources they offer that might not be known to some of the folks who are watching?
Sure, thank you, Chuck. In the broadest terms, the Office of Global Partnership is there to build bridges beyond ourselves. We serve as a bridge for developing and nurturing relationships between the Episcopal Church and our partners around the Communion and the wider international community. Our staff include 4 partnership officers who have many years of experience in working with partners in specific regions around the Anglican Communion. They cover Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Jerusalem and the Middle East. They are resources for the church as we strive to develop and nurture relationships across the Anglican Communion. And I know I can speak for every single one of them that they're always very open to be in conversation with partners across the Episcopal Church. We have a Mission Personnel Office, as Chuck had mentioned in his introduction, that facilitates the Young Adult Service Corps the YAS program, which has now been running for 20 years, which sends young adults overseas, young adults between the ages of 21 and 30 to have an experience overseas for their formation, but also to provide valuable ministry for partners around the world. And then we also have Episcopal Volunteers and Mission Program. These are for older adults between the ages of 30 plus, so it's a pretty wide range. And our missionaries really are the physical representation of that relationship that the Episcopal Church has with our partners. So it's a very important ministry, that hands-on physical presence. We also have a representative to the United Nations. This provides a voice to the UN from the Episcopal Church and in conversation with the UN. We are faith leaders at the United Nations, entering into dialogue on a wide range of issues, including the care of creation, human rights, sustainable development, and gender equality. In this work, we work closely with the Anglican Communion Office, as well as other faith-based and civil society partners in mutual engagement with the United Nations. And this year we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Actually, we celebrated in 2020. Sorry, we're now in 2021. And lastly, what I'd like to say is that our ministry is very broad. And it's important to note that we strive to partner with parishes, dioceses, and institutions of the Episcopal Church, not only in sharing our resources, knowledge, and expertise, but in many ways we see ourselves as a switchboard. We do not have all the answers, and I think that's important to share, but we so often know somebody who does through the ministry at many different levels. So we're in partnership with as many parishes, dioceses, and institutions in their ministries, and so we try and pool that information and then share it with as wide a range of people as we can. And we also work with the Global Episcopal Mission Network, GEM, and with the Standing Commission on World Mission, and are developing a number of projects with these institutions. And I will put a link to our website in the chat so that you can explore that a little further. For now, that's a good starter, I think.
Good. Yes, and it'll be important as we go later into this conversation to reflect on how some of these transitions we're going to see also affect our partners throughout the world. So thank you for that, David. Very helpful. Margaret, turning to you, we also don't operate in an ecclesiastical vacuum here in our own US context. Rather, we have many ecumenical and interfaith partners. Now, looking back over this past year and the incredible challenges we all faced, what did you witness in terms of collaborations? How also do you think that might continue or not in the coming year?
Thank you, Chuck, and great to be with you all. In December of 2019, I attended an international conference in the Middle East on interfaith dialogue and peace building. One of the speakers was an evangelical pastor from West Virginia. And he used the example of the opioid crisis to talk about peace building. In his town, Huntington, I think it was, I can't quite remember, he'd built a diverse coalition of Christians, Muslims, Jews, Episcopalians, Baptists, Pentecostals, people of no faith, and more to address this crisis. And at the end of his story, he said, you know, when your house is on fire, you don't ask your neighbor what church they go to. You just ask them for a bucket of water. And that line stuck with me some 2 months later when the COVID pandemic struck. And especially related to diverse ecumenical and interfaith coalitions of which the Episcopal Church is a part. These are the National Council of Churches, Churches Uniting in Christ, Christian Churches Together, the Congress of National Black Churches, Religions for Peace, Shoulder to Shoulder, to just name a few. And we often work together in coalition on a number of public policy issues. And we began to ask one another, are there buckets of water we each in our own organizations need to share. Mind you, each of these groups has a particular niche, and often one that does not exactly coincide with the others. Yet in this time of crisis, a deeper conversation emerged to address not just COVID, but also racial disparities that were being exposed, police reform, how might we work together on hunger or jobs or domestic abuse, which were also in pandemic mode. And amazingly, a lot of buckets were shared. First, we offered joint webinars looking at the political divisions, the racial issues, the healthcare disparities. And second, again, through the only means possible, regular Zoom calls and webinars, we built relationships by hosting worship and healing services, expressing grief, naming those who had died, looking for ways to speak across the divisions without denying they were there. These unlikely partners met through the spring and fall, inviting all to join. And so, like many of you in congregations, we discovered that a lot more people than expected attended, given the stay-at-home orders, and at least for those who were not essential workers. And that was also true related to our interreligious relationships. Shoulder to Shoulder, which addresses anti-Muslim bias, hosted what we called a virtual Ramadan road trip. In the past, it's been a real road trip, inviting people of all faiths to join a Ramadan iftar around the country. Many who might have been a little afraid to join before, on Zoom, were able to find a safe space for this experience. Seders like this happened as well, and no doubt a lot of Christian services too. So what does all this have to do with Washington? Well, I think the collaborations and coalitions strengthened during this past year among diverse groups of Christians and interfaith partners will be a continuing foundation for the work that lies ahead. Conversations across difference, listening in new ways, maybe not just for how we're alike or how we even all want or don't want the same things, but for the gifts of difference. That will, I think, help us to build bridges. And there are a lot of bridges to build. And at the same time, remember that bridges don't make the gap go away, but allow us to meet one another in a safer space. So I'm excited about the days ahead, even as a little trepidatious, believing that we really will be able to launch this work together across these differences. And that will give us some good direction, healing, and I hope some positive public policy answers as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Yes, let's explore more of that as we have further conversation. But let me turn a bit to Rebecca. Rebecca, you earlier mentioned priorities of the new administration. What about our priorities? What priorities does your office have? Drawing from General Convention and Executive Council resolutions, drawing from our church priorities. What do you have as you try to approach with both the administration and this incoming Congress? And how can people in our congregations and dioceses both learn more and do more?
Thank you. Yes, we, as Chuck mentioned, we follow, all of our advocacy is based in the resolutions of General Convention and Executive Council, going back decades and decades. So we always find a specific policy for us to, if we're signing a letter, having a meeting on Capitol Hill, or sending an action alert through the Episcopal Public Policy Network, we always look back to that. But we have 5 big picture categories that we are engaging on. And this is the direction of our church leadership with detailed resolutions and guidance from General Convention on it. So these are on racial equity. And what that means is that we are focused on COVID relief and addressing the disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other communities of color. We are looking at all kinds of equity issues around environmental racism, looking at criminal justice reform, police reform as a subset of that, and funding around issues of health disparity, maternal mortality, economic fallout, unemployment rates, a whole range of anti-poverty measures. as we look at racial reconciliation and healing, which is also a lens that really runs throughout all of our work. We're focused on immigration issues, and that includes refugee resettlement, but also some of the broader global migration issues that David spoke about in relation to our Anglican Communion partners, and also the immigrants who are in the US in our churches facing all kinds of issues, whether it's folks who have temporary protected status or dreamers, those individuals who have DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or the asylum rules, and those who are in our border ministries on both sides of the border, helping to care for those who are fleeing violence and persecution, looking for asylum. So we have migration, immigration, and refugees. We also look at human rights and peace building as a core component. Again, a lot of that is internationally focused, and we are listening to our Anglican Communion partners and others, and then bringing their voices and perspectives to the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, others, members of Congress, looking at religious freedom, human rights protections, and then conflict, and helping religious leaders and communities to be a voice for peace and reconciliation. We also look at creation care, so a whole range of environment issues around pollution, protection of the Arctic, which maybe folks have been seeing has been the news a fair amount around the lease sale in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So, looking at emissions questions, again, wherever we as a church have policy, we're willing and eager to engage in that space. And then finally, a broad anti-poverty agenda. We are called to serve the least of these. And so we look at anti-poverty domestically and internationally. And so that takes the form of advocating for food assistance for those who are hungry right now, for protections for those facing housing instability or homelessness, and also in the international sense to push for global health and funding for not just COVID relief and the vaccine distribution, but also AIDS, TB, and malaria, and some other infectious diseases that are really deadly if we're looking at it in a global context. So those are our big picture issues that we structure our work around. But we also have opportunities for people to be engaged in all of those and other issues. So I would encourage you to join the Episcopal Public Policy Network. We send out weekly action alerts on particular pieces of legislation, asking Episcopalians to take action, contact their member of Congress. We also have an EPPN Ambassadors Program, which is a smaller group of folks who really want to be involved closely with our office to connect with us on a weekly basis and hear from us and serve as an ambassador to their own parish and diocese and other contacts to help us spread the word about this advocacy work we're doing. We're starting weekly network calls at 1 p.m. on Thursdays. We're piloting this project for 6 weeks. So any EPPN member can join us Thursday at 1 and hear an update on what we're looking ahead to do, what we think will be hitting the floor in Congress. And so we'd love to have anyone who's on our network join that as well. And then I'll just say one final thing, that we in our office try very hard to build relationships with members of Congress, but it's you, Episcopalians and constituents, who are really making those calls and helping us to be effective in our work. And we are increasingly hearing that we need the voices of constituents to be able to make the case, especially leaders, so grass tops leaders, the people who really can speak for a community and share useful information. There's been just a huge growth in outreach to congressional offices, but the staffing levels remained the same. So one district said that in the year 2005, they got fewer than 10,000 messages. In 2011, close to 50,000, and in 2017, well over 100,000 messages. And that's that one office with just 18 full-time staff for a House member. So we know that there's a lot of volume, and we want to make sure that we as people of faith can have our voices be heard and can make sure that we can represent our values and that our government can respond.
Wow, that's staggering to hear those, the dramatic increase. Demetrio, you helped us understand more about the refugee resettlement process earlier, but what about asylum seekers, immigrants, these other aspects of migration movement? How do these differ from refugees? And what are ways in which EMM can help Episcopalians and congregations and dioceses engage in the ministry of welcome and inclusion for those who might find themselves as strangers in a strange land, especially as we move forward into this coming year?
Thank you, Chuck. Asylum seekers, flee persecution and land on our doorstep here in the United States to seek safety, and they do so by requesting asylum. To receive asylum in the United States, they must prove their persecution occurred and that it occurred as defined by US and international law. Seeking asylum is incredibly long, complex, and fraught, and a process that's fraught with a lot of intricacies. Many asylum seekers, as we have seen on television, are detained in jail-like conditions during this process. In the United States, asylum protections and the right to seek asylum have been restricted to almost impossible standards through a variety of regulatory and policy changes. And that's why the Episcopal Church, through Rebecca's Office of Government Relations, speaks out and advocates against these changes, which send people back into danger and encourages Episcopalians to take action through advocacy. With our colleagues in the field, a number of organizations and congregations and congregational partners, EMM works with them and supports education and their ministry efforts to protect asylum seekers. EMM will continue its efforts to serve as a convener of the Episcopal Asylum and Immigration Detention Network. These are a group of interested congregations that share their efforts or planned efforts to assist asylum seekers. And we invite, if you're not part of this network, to please join. And I will put on the chat box our website where you can actually join these networks. EMM also provides resources to those congregations that wish to look at developing a ministry for asylum seekers. In fact, in late 2019, EMM developed a toolkit for congregations, and it's presently in the process of being updated. And it's been one of our, one could say one of our hot items. We've had over 133 of these toolkits sent out to dioceses and congregations. I should also point out that when a person does receive asylum, they do become, they are asylees, and they are eligible for a number of federal assistance programs, which are offered by EMM resettlement affiliates. So once they do get asylum, they do get federal benefits through the programs that we administer through our affiliate offices. But unlike those that are asylees or the resettlement program, asylum seekers prior to their getting asylum get no government funding. So all the work that the church does to assist asylum seekers is done through the church's budget or through donations. And thanks to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we've been able to support asylum seekers through one of our sites in Texas that assists in providing referrals to asylum seekers through pro bono legal aid programs and other supports groups that are in the area. It's an activity we would like to amplify with congregations, but again, there's no government support for this. So we really do seek, it's either built into the church's budget or we seek donations to continue this ongoing effort.
Wow. Some very practical hands-on ways folks can be involved. Thanks for that, very much so. David, your office, as you said, includes mission personnel, and I appreciate your outlining a little bit about that. But in the past year, the pandemic grounded many of our missionaries and certainly most of our young adult service corps members. What does this mean moving forward with the new administration and as we begin to look at a post-COVID reality? And how, in that time, how has your team already started thinking outside the box in this area?
Yes, Chuck, it's certainly been an uncertain time in many ways. Earlier on, I said that our missionaries were the physical representation of the Episcopal Church overseas, and then COVID happened. Most of our young adults returned a few months after COVID started spreading. We just weren't really sure what to expect. And a number of our older adults remained in place. And as we enter into 2021, we are still living in uncertain times in terms of the missionary program. at this point in time, it's difficult to think about sending volunteers to work internationally outside of the borders of the United States, given the pandemic continuing on. And so what we've been doing is trying to be as creative as possible to look at new ways of working. Normally our Young Adult Service Corps work overseas, that's the nature of the program. But this coming year, we're looking at the possibility of growing a border ministry initiative with 4 dioceses of the Episcopal Church. Currently, we're providing some subsidies to support these dioceses in their border ministries to support local staff. And we're looking at the possibility of whether we can also support Young Adult Service Corps members to serve on the United States side of the border with partners in Mexico. So we're working with beginning those dialogues now, but we're also working very closely with the church in Mexico as well. So we've been providing funds for them to support their ministries, and really looking at how we can work on those borders. It's a very fluid situation, as we all know, in terms of migration and what's going to happen in the coming year. We are going to have a virtual discernment program. The deadline for discernment is February the 19th. You can find all that information online. And we're hoping to do an orientation probably in July, with a possibility of sending missionaries overseas, and also maybe a few placements within the United States as well. We continue to receive applications from older adults as well, older adults being those over 30, so we're pretty broad there with that definition of old. And we're open to being in conversation with people who feel like they've got a call to mission and not quite sure where to go with that. We're happy to be in conversation to look at all possibilities, again, given the uncertain times that we live in.
Yeah, that's tremendous work, that's for sure. Thank you for that. Margaret, beyond the political transition, as we've been hearing, as David was just alluding to, we're also looking down the road to an eventual transition to a post-COVID reality, a new normal, as some like to call it. But for some congregations and dioceses, this includes incredible economic challenges, possibly even questions of viability. How can our partnerships beyond ourselves be a help in facing these challenges?
Thanks. Well, I don't know about you all, but for me, church through this past year has been an ecumenical feast. We've all been able to hear sermons and attend worship from around the world, and even close to home, the church next door that has recorded its sermon, and to participate with the work of a lot of different faith groups. And I think what has happened in that case is that it has opened up many possibilities for local sharing. Lutherans have a resource they called Engaging Others, Knowing Ourselves. And this has really been true for me during this time. It was already happening, of course. We're already sharing resources for all sorts of reasons, but now we're hearing about more and more joint worship services, more sharing of buildings, sharing of administration, building coalitions to address human need. All those social services and projects that folks had already been engaged in locally, I think, have become deeper and deeper. We're living really in a time of cultural and social transformation. We know our neighbor is as likely to be a person of another faith as a Christian. We're an increasingly diverse country and a multicultural society. So our ecumenical and interreligious work, I think, is more and more broad. Local councils of churches are now both ecumenical and interfaith. I'm sure that you all are experiencing that in your own places. And we're learning how to address those issues in a much broader way. The ELCA, for example, is developing guidelines for interfaith work on how to respond pastorally to people and into communities, especially, for example, in times of tragedy or something as traditional as a wedding. Each diocese, by the way, has an ecumenical and interreligious officer. And if you don't happen to know who that is, I'll be happy to send that information. And I'd love to hear from you all about what's happening in your own diocese and congregations as you respond. And as SEEP has already begun responding to imagining what this new normal will look like. So I look forward to learning about that from you all as well.
Thanks, Margaret. You spoke about some of the ways in which we've seen a lot of collaboration, a lot of coming together. At the same time, let's face it, y'all, we have seen this in this election season, kind of an opening up of just how significant the divisions are amongst us in this country. Divisions that show little sign of disappearing. How can we address this reality within our congregations and dioceses? What tools might we have for us to make use of? And how can we address this reality beyond ourselves as well, beyond just us in our churches, but with the communities in which we live? I open that up to anyone. Rebecca, do you want to, you're nodding, you want to take a stab at that first?
Sure, I would point folks to some work we've done for a good amount of time now on civil discourse. We have a civil discourse curriculum, Make Me an Instrument of Peace, that is about talking across difference and having the ability to build relationship. And then there's a project that will be, I guess, is up now on our website that also highlights that from Many One. But there's also, I think, as a part of this landscape that we're in now, I think it's important to note the prevalence of disinformation. And we also have a whole series on that. I think that when we're living in different worlds and realities, it's also important to note what is not real information and what has been, what is believed by some people. So I think that's another important resource, as well as the civil discourse work, to be aware of some of the more insidious, whether intentional or not, things that we can pass on that are not true.
Margaret, you've been involved recently with my colleague Canon Stephanie Spellers and a team of folks in talking about a program that's literally just been rolled out as of this week, from Many One, coming off of course, the words E Pluribus Unum, and words that have been spoken by our presiding bishop quite a bit in recent sermons and statements. Do you want to say a little something about that as well?
Yes, Rebecca just mentioned that the subtitle from Many One is indeed Conversations Across Difference. And the idea is for folks in congregations, folks in dioceses, to take this on as a sort of local manifestation of the kind of work that we really are going to need to do in our time in order to speak across the aisles, so to speak. Each of us is aware that we have people that we love in our families, in our very close circles, who have different understandings of how we should be developing public policy, or how we even should be living our lives. And it's been really hard to have those conversations over the last few years. And our hope is that this is a way to get at just crossing those divides, but not pretending that they're not there, but listening with love. Learning how to listen for difference and appreciating those things that are right. Oh, I had never thought of it that way before.
And Margaret, how do we find out about this? Because this is brand new. So
Yes.
we go, how do we go to, where do we go to find this out?
Thank you. We will put that web link on the chat. It's
Excellent,
just
excellent.
opening up. It's on but it is also on the website for the Episcopal Church, episcopalchurch.org. And I will look for the specific link and put it in the chat.
There's other programs that are out there as well, and many of which are actually included when you go to that site. You can learn about some of the other ones, not only the curriculum on civil discourse that Rebecca mentioned, but also outside programs like Braver Angels, something that Bishop Mark Beckwith brought to our attention in these past few months, and other programs that are all listed somehow in there with the From Many One. So yes, thank you for that. As we begin to turn to inviting questions from you all, we've gotten a couple already in the chat room, and we'll respond to those, and would love for others to put down your questions or comments. And we'll try to respond to as many as possible. Thanks to Melanie Mullen, by the way, for who I see has just put the link from anyone. Thank you, Melanie. Glad to see you have that. But as I address a couple of the questions that have been put in the chat room, please do keep adding to them, all of you who are listening in, and we will try to see who might be able to answer those and maybe have some questions for one another as well. So earlier I saw that Scott and Becky asked a question: how best can we advocate or promote vaccination to undocumented immigrants? Can churches become sanctuary inoculation sites? I don't want to assume that fears of ICE will go away after January 20th. Who would like to speak to that? Demetrio, Rebecca, either one of you?
Sure, I think that's a great idea to offer church sites as a place for vaccinations. The sanctuary idea came from an Obama era memo about sensitive locations where ICE was directed not to go. And of course, a memo can be undone. And in the Trump era, we've seen some of those actions. So I expect that it will be put in place again in the Biden administration. But to the question, I think it's true that we can't expect people to then kind of overcome reasonable fear in just a moment. But I think ideally partnering with local authorities, health authorities, to make sure that those who are undocumented are able to get vaccinations would be great. And I would say that is happening at the state level and the local level as well. So being in touch would be fantastic. And we'll also follow up in our advocacy. We've been pushing very hard throughout the COVID relief process to make sure that people, regardless of immigration status, are able to access the benefits and are able in particular to get the health benefits so that we contain the pandemic. We will continue advocating for that. And my experience so far with the Biden transition team is that they are very receptive.
Anyone want to add to that? Demetrio, Margaret, anyone want to add to that?
Well, I know the human rights advocates that work along the border are very sensitive to what's happening in many of the detention centers. And they certainly do want to ensure that, and we do know that there have been, in the past few years, deaths in those detention centers with, and there are certainly monitors there, and they do want to monitor the situation and ensure that anyone who seeks asylum are treated humanely along the border. And those human rights groups, EMM is part of a coalition of organizations that look at migration issues in general, specifically along the border. And Human Rights Watch is one of those organizations. They certainly are monitoring the situation there to ensure that asylum seekers are treated humanely at the border, and that any health concerns that are addressed appropriately by the governmental authorities in charge.
You know, in this past year, one of the things that happened very early in the pandemic was a coming together on Mondays for a half hour of bishops and canons, the ordinary, to have conversations, Zoom conversations. This was sponsored by my colleague, Canon Mark Stevenson, and the incredible folks at Episcopal Relief and Development. And in these conversations they had many, and early on, there was quite a few conversations on things like the PPP, on things like COVID relief for churches, on tax issues. I noticed in the chat room now that Peter Johnson raised a good question today about the fact that we are concerned that potential tax increases, especially capital gains, may significantly affect our parish development and endowment. What are your thoughts about new policies as they relate to the economics of charitable giving and donations? Rebecca, you want to tackle that one a bit?
Sure, and I'll just say that I think for some of this, we will have to wait and see. Some of the Biden tax proposals do have an increase on high earners, on capital gains, some around the charitable deduction. But we've also seen that President Obama had proposed some of those same changes, and they were not enacted in the end. So I think a lot will depend on what Congress is pushing for. So around charitable deductions, for instance, President Obama had proposed the change, it was never enacted. So we'll see, I think, what things end up being. But yes, the tax plan and proposal does have a steeper tax rate on higher income, and then also on capital gains, and some kind of interesting carve outs around charitable deduction and caps on that.
David, you and also Margaret, in some of your work, each of you deals a lot with things far beyond our shores. And so I'm curious, how is this transition going to impact on our communion partners out there and others with whom we interact on the worldwide level? And how important is it now for our churches to strengthen relationships with those outside of the Episcopal Church?
It's a great question, hopefully very positively. I was just struck by what Margaret was saying and Rebecca about having conversations with people of different viewpoints. And I think that's incredibly important. As a global mission person, I'm always wanting to wave the flag for our global mission conversations as well. And a reminder that our neighbor is not just within our borders, but also beyond. So what I often say is that in the parable of the Good Samaritan, there were no geographical boundaries put upon who is my neighbor. And a lot of actions that are taken by the US government affect our partners in a very significant way. And it would be helpful for us to hear stories from partners, parishes, dioceses, institutions about what is happening around the Anglican Communion. We have our networks, but it's always good to listen to others. As Rebecca has said, we have a strong advocacy program through the Office of Government Relations. And we're also have a voice at the United Nations. So we are in conversation at the United Nations in discussions such as global access to vaccines, for instance. So it would be helpful for us to get information feedback on things like that. If there are specific issues that affect our partners, it would be good to know that we do have access diplomatically to embassies, to the House, and to the United Nations. So I think there's hope for the future. There's definitely going to be a strengthening of diplomatic conversations, I think, on the national level through the US government, which we're very excited about. And we're hoping that many doors will continue to open in the coming year.
Margaret, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to follow up by noting that I spoke a lot about our domestic ecumenical and interfaith coalitions. We are also in the Episcopal Church, a member church of the World Council of Churches. And they are very much in touch with the churches in the US and lamenting from time to time what seems to be too much isolation. And even though last week, they are also watching with hope and care and many prayers about what is happening in the United States. So on January 7th, the morning of January 7th, the member churches in the US got a really strong pastoral letter of solidarity from the World Council of Churches to say they were praying for us and hoping that peace can come again in the halls of Congress related to that insurrection moment. And so we have those partners in coalition, and we have those partners in prayer and worship as well.
What are your hopes as you look to this transition? Rebecca, what do you and your team there in the Office of Government Relations, what are some hopes you have?
I think it presents an opportunity for us to really move forward on some of the priorities that our church has identified over the past decades. These past 4 years have been challenging for a lot of the things that we work on, such as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, like refugee resettlement, a lot on the anti-poverty programs and support, a lot around our international alliances and partnerships and work in that arena too. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to formulate good policy, recognize that that looks different for different people of different political persuasions, but to, in good faith, be able to build relationships with the Congress and people in the administration and have policies be enacted that really are for the best of Americans and of people around the world, and that showcase our American values, and then also for us who are Christians and Episcopalians, the Christian values we hold dear.
Thank you. Others, what are your hopes?
Well, I am excited because it feels to me as if there is an invitation for faith voices to engage the conversation about all of these public policy issues that that you are speaking about, that we are speaking about today. Last week, we spoke with someone who said, I want to help us have the voices of faith in every area and not off to the side somewhere among issues that are just particularly of concern to churches. So I think there's an openness right now to voices of faith in the Office of Neighborhood. I'm not sure what the name of the office will be when it comes to the next team, but there will be a lot of conversation about how faith, and I think an understanding that the faith is a really broad category, and that religion and our faith-based work is important to all the public policies that will be made in the next years. So I'm excited about that openness.
David, do you want to add anything?
Well, at the risk of being political, my hope is that we would look at putting humanity first and really look at human rights and justice on a global scale. I think as Christians, we're called to look beyond ourselves and to work with brothers and sisters all around the world. And I think I'm hoping this new administration will enable us to do that on a church-wide level and also on a national level more easily.
Demetrio.
Well, for EMM, I'm very optimistic about the future. For a number of years, EMM, the resettlement program of EMM, was basically under a sword of Damocles. We were expected anytime to be defunded by the government as they started to dismantle the resettlement program during the past few years. So it breathes new life, and it's an opportunity for us to re-engage, as I said earlier, engage our congregational partners that form the backbone of the resettlement program to re-engage with this program, which is a transformational ministry. It really speaks to our Christian values, and I think it's important. And to that regard, I'm very optimistic about the future.
I'm also aware that we are in the Episcopal Church, as much as also in other churches, but certainly in the Episcopal Church, we are a big tent. And we have folks who are red and blue and purple all together in this thing. The presiding bishop has truly been striving to, throughout his time, to remind us that first and foremost, we are followers of Jesus Christ in this wonderful Episcopal and Anglican tradition of ours, and trying to make a difference in the world around us, whatever our specific political stance. Indeed, to always put others first, as David said a few minutes ago, but to recognize that that often may mean some hard work of conflict resolution and conflict management amongst ourselves in our congregations. We also are going to have, amidst the hopes of this, for many in coming up, we also have some stark realities. We do have questions about economic struggles and even viability for some congregations. For dioceses, economic struggles. Some have done well so far, and we rejoice in that. But we are all very aware of how precarious everything is. And so as we look to this coming year, as we look to this transition, as we look to the transition to a post-COVID reality, whatever that looks like, It certainly will not mean going backwards, whatever that looks like. As we look to the political transition, to all the different transitions, it is really, truly important to recognize that that our first and foremost call always, if we are members of this Episcopal Church, is to see how we can continue to further the work of the Jesus movement, continue to make a difference, continue to welcome all folks in our midst, and to find out how we can take our values and be able to share them with one another, with others, to hear others and the values they bring to the table, the fears they bring, the hopes they bring, and to hopefully make a difference in this world for the sake of Jesus' love for the world. So it has been a pleasure and a privilege to have you four leaders in the ministry beyond the Episcopal Church to help us just reflect a bit on what it means to look at this year of great transition. And I'm deeply grateful for the privilege to all the rest of you. It is a privilege every day to work alongside these leaders and the teams that they represent. I also am deeply grateful for all the staff of the Episcopal Church's office, for all the presiding bishop staff, for my fellow canons, and all those who are working for and with you all out there in dioceses and congregations to try to make the difference we just talked about. So please continue to come offer your questions, your insights to us. Seek resources from us and bring resources to our attention. And again, my deep and profound thanks to Joe Swimmer and the good folks of the SEAP Network, not only for this particular opportunity, but for all the webinar opportunities of the past year and the ones that are coming up. We're just the first of many. These have been a godsend to many. So thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we wish you every blessing as you continue your day. Thank you and take care.